Good evening. I'm Cassie Pekarsky, Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Truman Library Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone in person and online to tonight's program, the fifth in our annual Truman Legacy series, Women Rising. A special thanks to the Martha Jane Phillips Starfield of Interest Fund for partnering with us to create, launch, and support the Women Rising series. Their generosity allows us to better profile the women who found their place on the world stage during the Truman administration, to reflect on their contributions, and to share their stories as a catalyst for promoting women as activists and leaders. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this evening's program. If you would like to ask a question, please make your way to the aisles at the appropriate time, and please make sure that your question is a question. In commemoration of the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we are here this evening to explore the important role of our founding mothers and the women who held what has been called the second hardest unpaid job in the nation, First Lady. Before we do, though, allow me to plug a few upcoming events in our America 250 series. On April 14th, join Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Rick Atkinson for an evening exploring the pivotal middle years of the American Revolution, as told in his celebrated new book, the second in the Revolution trilogy, The Fate of the Day, The War for America, Fort Ticonderoga to Charleston. On April 23rd, we're planning a star-spangled event to celebrate the enduring legacy of our 33rd Commander-in-Chief and to raise funds for the world-class presidential center dedicated to our nation's founding ideals. The 27th Wild About Harry will feature honoree and keynote speaker David Rubenstein in conversation with historian Douglas Brinkley. On May 14th, historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist H.W. Brands will discuss his newest book just 2 days after its release. American Patriarch, The Life of George Washington presents an inspiring portrait of the man who was called on time and again by his peers to lead. And last, but certainly not least, on April 20th, a once-in-a-generation collection of documents on loan from the National Archives will be on view at the Truman Library. Only on view until May 24th, don't miss the opportunity to experience milestone documents from our American story, including, are you ready for this? The Senate revisions to the Bill of Rights, the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, the joint resolution proposing the 13th Amendment featuring Abraham Lincoln's signature, Plessy v. Ferguson, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, Germany and Japan's World War II instruments of surrender, the North Atlantic Treaty, Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, Executive Order 9981 desegregating the US military, Brown v. Board of Education, and many more. I kid you not. Learn more about the exhibit and events at our website, trumanlibraryinstitute.org. Now, over the last 5 years, we have examined and elevated the stories of the women Air Force service pilots, the American women code breakers of World War II, Anna Rosenberg, who was the first Assistant Secretary of Defense, then the highest ranking woman in the department's history, and the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. This year, we decided to take a cue from President Truman, who once said, "I hope someday someone will take the time to evaluate the true role of the wife of a president and to assess the many burdens she has to bear and the contributions she makes." As the New York Times noted in her obituary, Bess Wallace Truman may have chosen to stay in her husband's shadow. She once said, "A woman's place in public is to sit beside her husband, be silent, and make sure her hat is on straight." But she played an invaluable role in Harry Truman's political career. She always helped. Truman once described her saying, "She was my chief advisor, She always helped me in everything. She was a partner in all my transactions, politically and otherwise. Now, as many of you may know, Truman was a prolific writer. The Truman Library preserves more than 1,300 letters that Truman wrote to Bess between 1910 and 1959, but only 184 letters sent in the opposite direction. And it's not because Bess never wrote back. In December 1955, Truman walked into their home at 219 North Delaware in Independence, Missouri, to find Bess throwing bundles of her letters to him in the fire. When Truman asked in horror, "What are you doing? Think of history," Bess calmly responded, "Oh, I know," as she kept tossing in her letters. So what do we really know of Bess Wallace Truman? Arguably the most important woman in the Truman administration. What do we really know about any of the first ladies? The influential women who serve as the president's most trusted counselor, confidant, moral compass, and sounding board. How did the first ladies establish the role, influencing not only policy, but the formation of the presidency and our great nation? What lasting imprints have they left on the direction of our country? It's an incredible pleasure to welcome Anita McBride to answer these big questions for us tonight. Anita is an internationally recognized expert on the legacies of American First Ladies and operations of the White House. In 2024, she co-authored Remember the First Ladies, The Legacy of America's History Making Women, showcasing the evolving role of the First Lady and its historical influence on the American presidency, politics, policy, and global diplomacy. Our partner, Rainy Day Books, is here tonight with a limited supply of signed copies. Make sure you don't leave without one. She also co-authored a first-of-its-kind textbook filling a critical gap in academic literature on the study of First Ladies and their accomplishments. And for the little one, she's co-authored a children's book with her daughter, First Ladies Make History. Now, Anita is executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University's School of Public Affairs, where she leads the First Ladies Initiative. She's a founding member of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. She is co-chair of In Pursuit, a national civic education initiative of More Perfect in partnership with Substack, launched to mark America's 250th anniversary. The project features weekly essays by presidents, first ladies, justices, historians, and military and civic leaders that reflect on lessons of US leadership and connect our history to the pursuit of a more perfect nation. Anita wrote the upcoming essay on Bess, which will premiere in late September. Now, McBride's expertise on the White House and the influence of First Ladies didn't come from the books. It was acquired through 2 decades of experience serving in senior roles under Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush in both the White House and the U.S. Department of State. She also served as Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush and directed the First Lady's work on a wide range of global and domestic initiatives, becoming one of the longest tenured women in White House history. On the stage with her this evening is a man who needs no introduction, but deserves one. David Von Drehle is a New York Times best-selling author and award-winning journalist, best known for his work as editor at large for Time and as a columnist for the Washington Post. He's authored 5 books, including Rise to Greatness, Abraham Lincoln and America's Most Perilous Year, and most recently, The Book of Charlie, both of which are available at Rainy Day Books. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Anita McBride and David Von Drehle.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out to this very eagerly anticipated event. I've been hearing about it for weeks and weeks. I think 800 signed up to attend. This large group in the room, and then we're joined by a large group watching virtually. It's an honor and a thrill to be with you,
Same for me.
Anita McBride, and Cassie covered enough.
covered a
I'd
lot.
like to go on more,
That's
but
right.
let's get to it,
Let's get
because
right
this
to it.
is, as I was making notes for this, this could go on all night, really. There
Well,
are
it's 250 years
so
of
many
history.
fascinating
Yeah.
women that we're going to talk about. But
Right.
why don't we maybe start sort of chronologically?
Sure.
We can tell how you got interested in the subject.
Correct.
And you found an empty field, really understudied. Why don't we start at the beginning? Martha Washington, Abigail Adams,
And Dolly.
and Dolly Madison. They had no idea what they were getting into. Nobody had ever done it before.
That's exactly
and
right.
There's no instruction manual. How did they approach it?
And there still is no instruction manual. That's what's so fascinating about this role. You know, there's 35 words in the oath in the Constitution for the President of the United States. There's not one word about the First Lady. Never was, never has been. No statutory authority, no constitutional responsibilities, no salary. But that gives you a wide platform to do what you want to do with the job. And going back to our First Ladies, particularly the first one, Martha Washington, who did have the burden of setting precedent for a role that never existed before. But her husband's role never existed before either in any form of government anywhere. To have an elected person as both head of government and head of state. And so George Washington knew immediately that his was a two-person job and that he needed someone to assist him with the ceremonial duties of head of state. And lucky for him, Martha Washington was a very experienced hostess at Mount Vernon. And then, of course, you know, she had been married before to a wealthy man and actually inherited a considerable amount of money from him. That interesting for a woman of her time that she maintained a certain level of control of that inheritance and used it, though, a great deal of it to fund the Revolutionary War. The soldiers kept them fed, kept them clothed. And so that just underscores how these early First Ladies, these early founding mothers were so profoundly devoted to the success of this new nation, the success of their husbands. There was no guarantee this form of government was going to survive. And there were great challenges to it and early factions. We think we have political divisions now. It was the same at our country's founding. So her ability to take this new role, and in fact, George Washington knew how important this was in the way that he welcomed her to New York, our nation's first capital. She was not there for his election. She was not there for his inauguration. She came 6 weeks later. She closed up Mount Vernon. He received her on the shores of New Jersey and then brought her over to New York to great grand fanfare so that the people would see how important he valued her position. So that gave her, you know, an opportunity to use that platform in a way that was important to help her husband. And how did she do that? She did that by using her social hostessing roles. She brought people together at their home in New York. Different days of the week were for different groups. And what that did, but to be able to establish a way to do that, to be accessible to the public, but still maintain a level of formality that would be seen as appropriate on the world stage. It was not easy. She was followed, of course, by Abigail Adams, who learned a great deal from Martha Washington, but had a different, she had a harder time holding her tongue. You know, she was, of course, a great confidant and very politically astute, another woman ahead of her time, a great advisor to her husband, John Adams, another one who sacrificed dearly in the founding of our country, endured long separations from her husband, when he was overseas trying to raise money for our war effort, and then his time in Philadelphia in the Constitutional Congress. His time overseas she referred to as her widowhood, how many years she spent away from him. But she was, by and large, one of his most important advisors. She did not tolerate dissension of him. That was one of her difficulties. She would plant stories about her husband, either anonymously or through family members or through friends, that supporting her husband and his policies. She knew that he did not enjoy the same level of reverence that the first president did. And so she was very conscious of protecting that.
She was the first to live in the White House.
That's right, in very short time, David, very short time. That White House, the cornerstone was laid in 1792 by George Washington. It wasn't finished until November of 1800, and it wasn't even finished. John Adams moved in first, and then she came shortly after and had only 3 months to live there.
Which might have been enough. I mean, it was,
well, there's actually one picture in the book that what is now the East Room, she used as a laundry room. She hung her laundry. When she moved in there were still, the walls were not finished. There were no draperies. It was cold. It was drafty. It was not an auspicious start, that's for sure.
I think all of us as kids were sort of encouraged to think of the first charismatic First Lady as Dolly Madison.
Yes, for sure.
Is that accurate?
That is definitely accurate, and she set the standard for social entertaining that went unmatched for decades. And really, of the three, first ladies, she's really considered the great unifier. She really knew how to bring people together. She used the White House in a way that could really help her husband, who didn't really enjoy the same charismatic personality that she did. And so she would have these wonderful events in the White House, parties and her salons and her big events that they were called squeezes, because you literally had to squeeze in the room. So many people came, and what her superpower was is she invited people on both sides, of the aisle. And she would be very visible to me, because she wore a big plume on her head. She wore low-cut dresses, very colorful, and people in the room knew where Mrs. Madison was. And she would work the room. And so her husband, and gather valuable pieces of information that were very helpful to her husband. And frankly, she is valued as a great social hostess and was valued by him for that, but he valued mostly her political astuteness.
And because we live in the times we live in, that was job one of the Madison administration was national unity, right? Because
absolutely.
the Adams faction and the Jefferson faction had split immediately after Washington left.
Exactly, which was very difficult for John Adams.
Right. So.
And then we were on the verge of war with Great Britain, of course, and which did happen. And the city of Washington was burned in 1814. The White House was destroyed. The Capitol was burned.
Is it a true story that Dolly saved the Gilbert Stuart
It is
portrait?
not legend. It is true. She directed that the portrait of George Washington be cut from its frame and rolled up. And they were slaveholders. They were slaves that were serving. The first 9 or 10 first families were slaveholders. And she did direct her servants to cut the portrait out of the frame, roll it up, take it to safety. Not because she was just protecting a beautiful piece of art, but it was because she knew if that had been captured by the British and brought back to Great Britain, it would be paraded in the streets of London as a prize of war. And she just did not want that to happen. But beyond that, she also directed that very important document, founding documents of our nation that were there was no our national archives then. These were in the house, in the president's house, that those be carted off to safety too. So she really became like the nation's first archivist at that moment, again, as the city of Washington was burning. And so there was a table set for a grand dinner that she was going to be hosting that night. President Madison was out reviewing the troops in Bladensburg, Maryland, and so she's presiding over the house as the British are getting closer and closer, and they escaped and they were left in wagons with the carts of these treasures. And the British, sure enough, did come, but before they burnt the house, they ate all the food and drank all the wine. And that, by the way, one of the other successes of all of her parties is she served a really mean rum punch. So she got people very loose with, to talk about what they knew.
I mean, I could talk about every one of them. Like I said, we could be
I
all night, but we
know, it's
can't.
so
We can't do
fabulous.
that. So,
No.
my own interest, and I think a lot of people have this interest. What's your take on Mary Lincoln?
Yes. This is really one of the great, tragedies of how, first ladies are measured in our history. And there are some surveys that have been done over a number of years. The most recent one was in 2020. There's 3 or 4 before that. And for her husband, always ranks at the top, number 1 in the surveys of presidents. She always ranks at the bottom. And it's really unfortunate how misinterpreted she was. And some of her own bad press was of her own doing. For example, they come in 1861 where, the stirrings of civil war are around them. The White House is in pretty bad shape. She was already very conscious of the fact that the elite, political elite, did not think Lincoln was up to the job, thought he was sort of a backwoods person from a backwoods area and was not sophisticated enough to be president, and she wanted to change that view of him. And part of that is how she was going to entertain and bring people into the house and show that they were sophisticated and up to the job, both of them. So there was a congressional appropriation to repair, restore the house, get new things for it. And she spent that 4-year appropriation in 4 months. And it embarrassed her husband, of course, as things were difficult in the nation. She spent a lot of money on clothes, and she didn't have the money to always pay the vendors. And when the vendors were realizing they weren't being paid, they were starting to go public with the story. And it was, so some of those things are of her own doing, but the reason she wanted to do it was portray her husband in the best light that she could. And she also was not completely trusted by either side of both the Confederates and the Union. She had family members who fought for the Confederacy while her husband's trying to preserve, and died, and her husband's trying to preserve the Union. She lost, family members. She lost children, in the White House. And then, of course, sees her husband, assassinated. I mean, really paid such a great price. And this was a woman, though, again, just to tell a story of how politically astute she was. First of all, from when she was a little girl, she always wanted to be First Lady. She wanted to marry the President of the United States, and by God, she was going to make that happen. And so, she meets Abraham Lincoln, runs for Congress, has 1 term, loses his election for the 2nd term as Congress. And President Zachary Taylor at the time wanted to give him an appointment as the governor of the Oregon Territories. And she convinced Abraham Lincoln not to do it. She said, if you do that, it will take you out of the national political scene. And she was right. So you can argue he would not have been president if it weren't for her.
Not everyone knows she was the runner-up for the hand in marriage was Stephen A. Douglas of Lincoln-Douglas debate fame. She was romantically involved with both of them.
That's exactly right. I'm telling you, because she knew one of them was going to win. She was going with the winning team. We know a lot of people in politics like that. That's so funny.
So these are all household names.
Yes.
You talk in your book about some really important later 19th century first ladies who began to give some shape and form, and also and begin to shape the idea that the First Lady should have an agenda, should use her quote-unquote office as well. Talk about that. Carolyn Hayes, and then of course Ellen Wilson.
Sure.
Not 19th century, but
sure. So
early.
I'll tell you one of my favorite stories of a woman of that era is Caroline Harrison, President William Henry Harrison's wife, and this is the 1890s. They move into the White House. Big family, big extended family was living in the White House. And like all first ladies, are asked to champion a cause or raise money, put their name behind something. And she was asked by Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, Maryland, to raise money for the medical school. And she agreed to do it on one condition, that they would admit women into the medical school for the first time. Yeah. And they became the first medical school in the country to do so. And you think about this is 1890, women still didn't have the right to vote. They really didn't have rights, and we should really, talk about that. I mean, the title of our book is Remember the First Ladies, taken from Abigail Adams' admonition to her husband to remember the ladies in the writing of the Constitution. But women didn't have rights until 133 years later.
Right.
And so there was, they were growing social movements, of course, in the country. And you can point to her as an example as someone who is, pushing women forward. You had people like Sarah Polk, President Polk's wife, who was, he was a congressman from Tennessee. She was very, very involved in his election. Women still, of course, didn't have the right to vote. When he was elected, she was so well known from the campaign and really so beloved, and was referred to as membress-elect when he was referred to member-elect, because she was seen as a partner to him. And he eventually became Speaker of the House. She garnered very valuable relationships through that, used it to his benefit as president, would write his speeches, would clip articles from newspapers. I mean, she was very involved in knowing what was going on. And what was so interesting about her, what was her superpower is, even though women didn't have right to vote, she was seen as such a valuable partner to his presidency, but not overstepping her bounds. So she respected the deference to men, but had an enormous impact on him. Social movements, like you mentioned, Ellen Wilson, very involved. Of course, we're in the 20th century now, but she was very involved in the eradication of slums in Washington, D.C. Helen Taft was very involved in prison reform issues in the country. She was very also involved in the in federal workplace improvement of conditions for women. So they exercised their power even when they didn't have rights. Now, Nellie Taft did consider herself a suffragist. The first ladies before her really did not.
Well, you mentioned this, going far enough but not too far, not being seen as overstepping, which is an issue, still to this day talked about, and how does this, how to occupy this role, and did any of these women, we'll get to more recent times, but did any of these women experience, was there blowback, was there pushback, criticism,
Sure. One example to Florence Harding, who of course becomes the first First Lady to actually be able to cast a vote for her husband, and she was pretty outspoken, and she also very involved in his campaigns. She owned a newspaper, ran a newspaper. Yeah, you would like that. Anybody in the news, and she was, in fact, we do use at the beginning of every chapter of our book, we have a quote from a First Lady. The only president we quote is Harry Truman, and it's the quote Cassie said that I hope someday people pay attention to the role of First Lady. Well, we are, Harry, we are, we're trying. But who was I talking about? Who was I just talking about?
No, Harding.
Florence Harding. So she says, she's asked about, of course, he wins a successful campaign for president. And she's asked a question, about that. She said, well, of course I know what's good for the president. I put him in the White House. So she was pretty out there, and that was, accepted, maybe not accepted by everybody. But yeah, sure, they just bump up against these limitations. And that's one of the things in the book too that we do, David, is as we're talking about all of these women, and we don't do it chronologically, we don't do it biographically, it's thematic, but the overarching themes are these. One, what is the status of women in the country at the time that these women were serving? How were they able to use their role, or confined by it, or push the model forward? What is their husband's view of the role? That is a huge factor on if they're able to be successful, if they have his support. One example of a president who did not want his wife to have a public role at all is Calvin Coolidge. And Grace Coolidge, it's unfortunate because there had been some movement of more social activism, this role of first ladies, even before there was a right to vote. And then he did not want her to have public role, so the position slid back a little bit. It was too bad because she was a very educated woman. She was a teacher of deaf children in Vermont. She was really one of our most beautiful first ladies, and actually her portrait in the White House, I think, is the most magnificent of them all. And he just wanted her to look beautiful, but to be quiet. And it could have helped him because he did not have a good reputation. He's referred to as Silent Cal, right? He didn't have a really exuberant, personality at all, and she could have been very helpful. So that's one example where, First Lady was prevented from really using her platform when we were starting to make progress.
But that didn't last long because within a few years, Eleanor Roosevelt was in the White
House.
House.
Broke the mold. She really did. Eleanor Roosevelt comes, into the White House, did not want to be First Lady, was very, very worried that this would consign her to a social hostess role only. And you have to think about what was Eleanor Roosevelt doing at this time. She was already writing a daily column for a newspaper. She had a weekly radio broadcast even before she came to the White House. She was on the public speaking circuit. She was making a lot of money. She was really, and she begged her husband, she begged Franklin to give her an official role. And he did not want her to, she said she would do anything for him, do his correspondence, do his schedule, she would do anything. And he did not want her to do that. But you know what, that lasted about 3 days because she comes into the White House and she now is hosting weekly press conferences with just women reporters who were being barred from the president's press conferences. So she's helping to support this growing, women in the workplace in this industry, in press and media. So they loved it. And I think in her 12 years, and she had 12 years to be First Lady, that's a lot of years to build a body of work. And she did over 348 press conferences that she did in the White House, in the residence. And she did ultimately fulfill a role for Franklin that was very important and became his eyes and ears, particularly during the New Deal programs, would travel the country, see the impact of what was working, what wasn't working, bringing that information, of course, to him. She became his eyes, ears, and his legs because he did not travel
Right, it was very hard for him
much.
to
It was
travel.
hard. She went overseas. She went to the Pacific, Theater after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We're now in World War II, and she also was the first voice that Americans heard on December 7th, 1941, because it was a Sunday night, and that was her weekly Sunday broadcast. The president had put out a statement, of course, but he didn't speak to the Congress till the next day in his Day of Infamy speech. And in her radio broadcast, she used it to really start to give courage to the American people, and particularly to the women, to the mothers, as she knew that their sons, their husbands would be going off to war. At the time, she already had 3 sons in the military that were serving. So she was extremely, outspoken, effective. There was nothing that she wouldn't do. She wasn't really into the hostessing role. I mean, she did it, but those were not, they didn't serve very good food at the White House during their tenure. They had a terrible cook, Henrietta Nesbitt, and the president didn't even like her food. So that was not really their thing. In fact, when the Trumans came into the White House and saw really the condition that the White House was in, it was not Eleanor's forte.
Describe their relationship.
Franklin and
Franklin and
Eleanor.
Eleanor.
Well, difficult relationship, of course, because he was unfaithful to her, and it was discovered, and she wanted to divorce him, and his mother, this is before he became president, because of course, as you know, he served also as governor of New York and had a public profile there. But it was Mrs. Roosevelt, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, that told, her son, if she divorces you, you're done in politics. There will be no future, for you. So they came to an agreement of how they were going to, live their lives. But it was very, very hurtful to Eleanor. And then, of course, I think he had promised no longer to have an affair with a woman he's having an affair with, but ultimately he did again, and she knew it. And this is how she just went about and then lived her life and had a very full public life. The platform of First Lady gave her that opportunity to do that, but I think it was personally painful. Yeah. And I think what also was very difficult for her, too, is that her children knew that this was still going on and never, told her.
My favorite fact, I think, about her, just because it is, to me, very evocative. Yeah. She was her Uncle Theodore's favorite, right? As a girl.
He walked her down the aisle.
Yeah.
Yeah, was her favorite. She had lost her parents young, and then, lived overseas, was in a finishing school there, just where she, really learned a lot, had great tutelage there. But yes, she was close to him. I think he saw something, clearly in her, real leadership. Yeah. I mean, he was a tough guy, too.
A tough guy, but he liked spunky women.
He liked spunky, and he was married to one.
Right.
Yes, of course he is. Well, his first wife, of course, as we know, died tragically in childbirth of their daughter, Alice, and then he had a prior relationship with Edith Caro. They were close to getting married and have some fight that to this day we don't know what the fight was that they broke off their long, relationship where everyone thought they were going to get married, but ultimately did marry and, went on to have 5 children of their own. And she was a very, very strong influence in his life. In fact, there's an excellent book, if I can just say, called The 5 Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and it talks about, it's great, Ed O'Keefe, it is really worth reading about these women around Theodore Roosevelt that really made it possible for him to be president of the United States. And in fact, so it's about his mother, his 2 sisters, and the wife who died, and then Edith. But one of the sisters, called Bammy, those who, had studied him and these relationships in his life, saying that she could have been president herself. That's how politically smart. She was the one that really helped to prop up her brother.
As long as we're on Roosevelt women,
yes,
we've got to give a little shout out to his daughter Alice.
Oh, sure.
The greatest Washington hostess, maybe of all time, though she was obviously never First Lady.
Right.
But most famous for her quote, if you don't have anything nice to say about anyone,
come sit
by
next to me. She was a force, that's true. And then married into a powerful family too. Married, Longworth family in Washington. One of the Capitol Hill buildings is, named for him. So she had a long tenure. And many, candidates too, would seek her, her approval as well, because she was the extension, of her father.
So, Bess Truman finds herself succeeding, coming up behind the biggest first lady personality, arguably, that the country had known, because of her public face, because of her strength of character and force of personality. How hard was that? How conscious was she of Eleanor Roosevelt?
I think very conscious, but she also knew she would never be Roosevelt and could never be Roosevelt. And actually said, I'm not going down into any coal mines, which is what Eleanor was doing, investigating, New Deal programs. But she was authentic to who, she was. And of course it was difficult to follow a figure like that and to follow, the country. And you see it at the library. I was there today too, and it just shows the dramatic, all the newspapers and the news reports, the death of Roosevelt. I mean, it was a shock. I mean, this is all the country had known for 12 years, right? And how difficult for Harry Truman too, but for Bess, who really did not want a public life. I mean, she was very influential. There's no question about that, but didn't seek the limelight, didn't want the press conferences, and was petrified of those press conferences, did one. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt tried to convince her this was important for you to continue these weekly press conferences I mentioned to you earlier. And so she agreed, she did one, she answered one question the year they were married, and she never did another press conference. That was it. And then she had some, public events that were, didn't turn out well for her. The christening of a new, plane out at National Airport, which is now Reagan National Airport, and the champagne bottle had not been scored properly. So she's whacking it 4, 5, 6, 7, like 10 times, and it's not breaking. This is all covered, and by the media, by television, and it was embarrassing for her, and it was part of newsreels that would play back then. If you went to a movie theater, there were newsreels that played before the movie actually started, and this whacking her trying to do this, but it was embarrassing, of course, and so that, was not an auspicious way to start something you didn't want to do anyway. But again, I go back to, saying, she was such an effective behind-the-scenes player, and the value of all those years of experience that she had understanding politics at the local level here in Missouri, of course, and then being a staffer to her husband when he was senator. She would clip newspapers, she would do the schedule, she'd do constituent correspondence. She knew what was happening in the district and in the state. She built valuable relationships with her counterparts, other Senate spouses. In fact, at the library today, I saw her, her pass, her Senate pass is one of the artifacts that were there. It was just so fascinating to see that. You could picture just walking the halls of Congress and working in that Senate office. And it just, so she found her own way to be herself. And of course, we know she also didn't want a public, such a public face too. She didn't want the intrusive press bothering her all the time. She didn't want, the news about her father having died by suicide to become public. I mean, it was embarrassing for her, tough for her mother. It was still the stigma associated with that. So there were reasons why she wanted to be more private. And it's tough for any of them to try and lead a private life in the public eye.
It occurs to me, just because we're so interested in the Truman family.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about the parenting role. So many of these women have been raising some get there with adult children.
Sure.
But some get there with
Little kids.
children that are still coming up. And you've watched people try to balance
Right.
those roles.
Right.
How tricky is that? Do you think I sometimes think it's a curse on children to be
Can be very hard.
presidential children.
Some love it because some love the limelight and like the perks that come with it. Others don't like having the Secret Service trail them around at school or at college, of all places, to have a Secret Service trail, behind you. Some, like Susan Ford, embraced it and loved it and had her prom at the White House, and so she was a popular senior in high school for that purpose, and stepped in to fill in for her mom when her mom was recovering from breast cancer, and really got to enjoy and experience things with her father. But Jackie Kennedy did not like it for her children to be photographed. She tried to really control that, and in fact, the president's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, whenever Mrs. Kennedy was going out to the Virginia countryside to ride horses, they'd bring those kids over to the Oval Office
They were
and
so
photograph
photogenic.
them.
I mean,
they were
they
photogenic.
were
They were beautiful
absolute
children.
camera
And you have one of the most iconic photos ever of
Yes.
presidential children, of John, the young John coming out under the desk, the Resolute desk. So I think, but in a broader stroke, to answer your question, of course, for all of these women that have children in the White House, have families, first and foremost, they are worried about their privacy for their children, safety and security of their children, the safety and security of their husbands. That's always top of mind before anything else. So it is, not easy, but I think they've all just, tried to make the best of it, of course.
A couple of friends of mine, 10 or 12 years ago, Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy, wrote a wonderful book called The President's Club, which was about the relationships between the living presidents and how they,
Yes, important book.
whether they're of the same party, whether they've even run against each other, how they need to bond and share this experience that no other human beings have.
Right.
Is there anything similar among first ladies that you see?
Nothing formal, and it's such a great question. I'm glad because I was really struck today at the Truman Library, the wall of the quotes of all the presidents who have quoted Harry Truman, and of both sides of the aisle. And I thought that is so terrific, and that's really underscores really how a presidential legacy that meets the test of time. And for first ladies, nothing that's formalized, but it is a small club too, like the President's Club. Of course, the presidents are different. Every problem of the world comes to the desk of the American president. First ladies get to pick and choose what they want to work on, and some first ladies have worked on things together. I think one of the great examples of that is Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford, who first they were both champions of the ERA, but mostly during health care reform in 1994 under the Clinton administration, it was Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter that went to Capitol Hill to testify together. It was Rosalind Carter testifying on why there needed to be more federal support for mental health, and Betty Ford, who was testifying on why there needed to be more federal support for women's health research, because she was a great example of that, what courage she showed 6 weeks after becoming First Lady, diagnosed with breast cancer, and goes public with it when the word breast or cancer wasn't even mentioned in public at those times, and showed such incredible courage. And really, there is great belief amongst the medical community that women's health is measured in 2 time periods, before Betty Ford and after. And that's an incredible legacy as well. But here, these 2 women teamed up to champion the ERA. They championed healthcare reform together. They became very, very close. And let's remember, Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford in a very contested race, but very close. But that was, so that's a great example. They've come together, first ladies have come together on other issues to support projects for the national parks. there's a great photo, there's two great photos of the largest gathering of first ladies in two places. One, the Reagan Library, and where a lot of them do come together for, funerals and library openings. But the other was in Washington, D.C., it was in 1994. I think there's a wonderful picture of first ladies sitting together backstage, ready to go on for a program for the U.S. Botanical Gardens, I think it was. It's part of a beautification project for Washington, which was really started by Lady Bird Johnson.
Lady Bird Johnson.
And so she's in that photo, and Barbara Bush is in, who had just been kicked out of the White House because Hillary Clinton was the new First Lady, and Mrs. Reagan was there, Rosalind Carter. There were 6 or so of them. So there are opportunities where they come together and work on things. I know from my own experience of being with Mrs. Bush, she and Mrs. Obama worked on a project together for an African First Ladies summit that they did with each other. Actually, one of the things that Mrs. Clinton had hoped that Laura Bush would continue was a project that Mrs. Clinton had launched during her time with the Save America's Treasures project, which was on the eve of the millennium in 2000. She launched this initiative to really protect some historic sites, but also document and things that were really told the story of our country. And Mrs. Bush did continue that project. She watched out for it in the federal budget, and then added a project of her own as a complement called Preserve America, working with communities all over the country to really take pride in their cultural heritage of their cities. So there are opportunities where they have.
Let's talk about First Ladies you have known now, and
sure.
not just researched, but so you certainly spent some time as a young woman around Nancy Reagan.
I did.
What were your impressions?
Well, I was afraid of her like everybody else in the White House. But I respected the fact Mrs. Reagan had a standard for the White House and how, things should be done. And that included even how women in the workplace should dress. I mean, we couldn't wear pants, and we wear pantyhose and skirts and dresses. And, looking back, I appreciated sort of that was my first entree into a workplace, that there was, a level of formality or respect for, where you were. I mean, her presence was deeply felt, and her, events were beautiful and brought a level of elegance back to the White House. And of course, they had some of the greatest entertainers in the world that were there for events, so that was a lot of fun. I mean, seeing Elizabeth Taylor and Bob Hope and, Frank Sinatra, and it was an amazing sort of time. But I did, she was feared amongst the staff. She was probably so not really given the level of respect that she should have been by some, including the president's chief of staff, who kind of ignored her.
Right.
And that didn't go, so well for him.
For the chief of staff.
Right.
Right.
She was someone who really, was committed to one thing only, and that was the success of her husband and his legacy. And she knew that particularly the role he could play in the relationship with the Soviet Union. In fact, a great book that came out about her called The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, written by Karen Tumulty, who you know from the Post, who had never written a book before,
Right.
didn't know Nancy Reagan, spent 5 years or more of research, and the premise of the book starts with how very early, on, she had a dinner at the White House with George Shultz. He had just become Secretary of State, had him over to the White House, and she started as planting these seeds about how, her husband needed to be the one to oversee the détente.
Barbara Bush, you think there's ever been a first lady whose public image and actual personality were farther apart?
No, it's so interesting. That's so interesting you say it that way, because I think you sort of see with Barbara Bush, what you see is what you get. She was another one, I think, who was comfortable in her skin. And it didn't start out easy, for her either. In the campaign of 1988, one reporter said to her that she looked more like George Bush's mother than she did his wife. And that was akin to just like slapping her in the face. But, her response was so classic Barbara Bush. She said, well, there are a lot of fat, old, wrinkled ladies that are pretty happy right now. So, it's just incredible. And, she, too, was a person who never tried to be anything that she wasn't. And she left office, with a stratospheric poll ratings. And I think, she also had a lot of years to prepare for this role. Serving with him overseas, serving at the UN, also the wife of a congressman. She liked Washington. She was very engaged, very involved. She had a lot of relationships on both sides of the aisle. Those relationships, were important to her throughout her entire public life. And, she did some pretty bold things as First Lady, too, very quiet. Like, for an example, to the first Christmas in the White House, she's reading in the newspaper how the shopping malls around the country were no longer going to allow the Salvation Army bell ringers to be there to ring their bells and raise money. So what does she do? She tells her press secretary, let's go up to Plaza Gallery Mall, which is in Washington, D.C. They bring the press. She goes to put money in one of the bell ringers' buckets. Well, what do you know? All the malls continue to have the bell ringers working, and she heard from the Secretary General of the Salvation Army after that, just with such gratitude that saved their effort every year. The other thing that she did, to a woman ahead of her time, early on in her tenure, is went to a AIDS orphanage in Washington, D.C. And this is a time, there was such a stigma around AIDS. People felt you can get AIDS from being in the same room with someone who was infected. There was a lot of blowback that the Reagan administration had not done enough and had sort of ostracized people who were living with HIV and dying of AIDS. And she goes up to this orphanage and hugs a baby infected with AIDS. Doesn't say a word, just soothes a crying baby who ultimately did die not long after that. But that image was so striking, and even, her husband's greatest critics recognized what an act of courage that was.
We're going to be taking some questions in a minute.
I know, I'm sorry, I'm talking so long.
It's
we're
all
running
on me.
out of time.
It's all on me.
No,
I haven't even gotten us
not
to
at
the end
all.
of the 20th century.
There's so many ladies we didn't talk about.
So we'll take a couple at microphones here and here.
Great.
Think of your question if you
love it.
want. But while we're doing that,
Yes, sure.
we've now had two women run as nominees
Yes.
for president.
Right.
One a former first lady and one a former vice president.
Right.
But both times there was some contemplation of what's the role of the first
Spouse.
first man, whatever
Right.
it would be called. Is when that happens, and I'm sure it will.
It will.
Do you think the role is going to be different?
You know what? I think this is so interesting. First of all, with Bill Clinton, if he had become the first spouse, how complicated is that? He was a president
Former
before,
president, first spouse.
right? And so, what do you call him? You're still going to call him President Clinton. And Mrs. Clinton had said while she was running that she would have carved out a role for him as sort of a global ambassador.
As far away from the White House
Yes.
as she could get him.
That was so interesting. What was interesting about that, I thought, how would he he disentangled himself from the foundation he was running, which really, would talk about conflict of interest. But very good, David. You get the laugh of the night. So it would have been interesting to see that. I think to Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, who was the first person to occupy the second gentleman role, when he was asked the question, what do you consider your most important responsibility as spouse of the vice president, he would answer the most traditional response, which was to support the vice president. So he understood too, again, so I think whether it's male or female, we will adapt, the position will adapt to the occupant and the needs of the time, but also recognizing they're not the elected official, no matter who it is. The president is. So they're there to support, be advocates, choose issues they want to be engaged in, but ultimately they're there to make sure the presidency is successful.
What's your question, sir?
Well, my apologies. I thought you were ready for questions.
I'm sorry.
No, we are.
We're ready for you.
I understood during the Revolutionary War, Martha Washington would ask George, what about the rights of women? And apparently she didn't really get a satisfactory response. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yet she did, in her own way, exercise control and rights over certain things that were hers, like, for example, her finances, but used them in support of the Revolutionary War. I think it was more Abigail Adams, at least in my research, who was more pushing that the role and the rights of women. But you could be right on Martha wanting to do that as well. I mean, she did, again, she came into the marriage with money, with property, with a notoriety of her own. So it's wouldn't surprise me one bit that she would encourage, her husband. First of all, I will say this, when she became First Lady, that was not the word that was used then, she was really annoyed at her husband's advisors giving her a list of things that they said she should do. And she did complain that she felt like a state prisoner and wanted to make her own schedule and have her own rules about what she wanted to do. In fact, one thing that she did do is she would only wear clothes made by American clothiers, which was so she could be really considered the nation's first fashion influencer, because again, to support an American industry. So she was smart.
Sir.
My question has to do with the funding of the First Ladies.
Yes.
And we've all seen
Yes.
the Jackie Kennedy raising money
Yes, that's right.
for the White House.
Yes.
When did the First Ladies start to get money, like to pay for their correspondence and to pay for all those
Yes.
things? Because to be in the White House, you have to be wealthy.
You have to pay for a lot.
Yeah, a lot
on
of
your
things.
own.
So I'm just curious.
I'm glad
It's
you
always
asked.
been amazing to me because she got a lot of heat for raising that money to redo the White House.
That's right.
Because it was in shambles.
Yes.
And I often think now, and the culture that we're in now,
Right.
I'm curious where that money comes from.
Yeah.
Because you should not have an IBM plaque on a picture saying, they paid for us to put that up.
I know. So you're asking two really important things here, and I'm glad that you raised them on Mrs. Kennedy and what she established, right? She came into the White House after, now the Trumans had done this enormous restoration, protected the White House because it was falling apart. And so the whole building had to be rebuilt. It was hugely expensive. And thanks to the Trumans, they pushed to have the most expensive way to do it, which could keep the historic exterior and rebuild from the inside. So that cost more. The Congress did not want to do that. They wanted to tear the whole building down because that was the cheapest way to go. But the Trumans prevailed. So there wasn't a lot of money left over to actually then furnish the White House inside. Up to that point, there was also no curator. So any of valuable collections or historic furniture, if presidents came in and didn't like it, they could toss it out, they could sell it, they could put it on auction. So a lot of things were lost. So Jackie Kennedy comes in and feels that the White House should be a showcase. It should be an American museum. It's the people's most important home. And she knew there would never be enough government money to do that. So she established the White House Historical Association, now in its 65th year, to raise private money, so to acquire the collections, to restore pieces that were really in bad shape, to fund things like the portraits of presidents and first ladies, to acquire acquisitions, China, whatever would be needed, but also to have an education arm. Now, her husband did not want her to take on this role of historic preservation. He and his advisors thought it was too elitist and that it would be hurtful to him, not helpful. He changed his mind, though, when she did a very famous, on February 14th, 1962, she did this walk and talk through the White House on CBS News. 70 million Americans watched that. And the first time many of them had ever seen the White House. She created such a bond between the Americans and their home and said it was the people's house. And, and encouraged people to be a part of it. She had the first White House guidebook printed that they would sell for $1 when you came through on tours. And it helped him, and it's still in existence. It's in its 34th or 35th printing now by the White House Historical Association. It's still a source of money for them. So she put these systems into place so that there would be private funding to protect the White House. And then your other point, so hopefully that answers your question on that piece.
It does, but is that White House Historical Society, is it apolitical?
Apolitical, it's nonpartisan. It is a 501c3, still in existence. I happen to be on the board, so I'm very proud of it.
Yeah.
But of the work, that we do, particularly the education arm and
That's terrific.
the preservation. Thank you, and the preservation of the collections. We don't do construction. We don't do the things like that are happening. That's outside of our mission. It's a hot topic now, of course. But when things were removed from the East Wing, it was our responsibility to take them, protect them, store them, and make sure, hopefully, that they can be used in a new East Wing.
So there's in storage.
There are things in
with
storage.
no political individual being able to take possession of them?
You not personally ever own them. They're part of the White House collection. Okay. Things are because now one of the things that Mrs. Kennedy did was establish a position of White House curator, so that there is actually, an inventory of what belongs to the White House. And this was something other first ladies had attempted to do. Caroline Harrison attempted to do that, and there's great stories of her crawling through the attic in the White House, and she had always one of the butlers behind her that would shoot the rats that were up there. Yes, and she was petrified of the rats, but she's trying to find china in pieces, and she was a painter of china, so she would paint porcelains and left items to the White House. But so other first ladies had attempted to really catalog what belonged to the White House. Lou Hoover paid 3 people out of her own pocket to do an inventory and a catalog. But it wasn't until Mrs. Kennedy, who established this position, and then Mrs. Johnson, under the Johnson administration, by executive order, it was formally established, and a committee for preservation of the White House was established. So we know what belongs to the White House. And we're still finding things that are you find them at auctions, and that's what the Historical Association did. If we can authenticate the provenance, then we'll go after it and bring it back to the White House and restore it and keep it in the collection. To your question about a first lady and when did she have a budget? Believe it or not, there was no budget for a first lady in her office until Rosalind Carter pushed for it in 1978.
Wow.
Incredible. And what's so interesting in her memoir and then also in Jimmy Carter's memoir, they both talk about how this was the only fight the two of them as a couple ever had because he campaigned on cutting the White House staff. After the Nixon, White House, and so the perception of the imperial presidency, the staff had grown too powerful. So he campaigns on cutting the White House staff, and here she is trying to grow it because he also handed her a responsibility, wanted her to chair the Mental Health Commission for the president. And so he's giving her responsibilities, and she was a very active and very involved First Lady. That was a very strong political partnership too, like the Trumans. But she successfully argued for a budget for the office of First Lady. It was written into the White House Personnel Authorization Act of 1978. She was the First Lady to actually put her office in the East Wing. Other First Ladies before that really operated out of their dressing room in the residence. So she really and she was the first to have a policy director. And then other First Ladies, expanded the staff over time. Mrs. Reagan was the first to have a chief of staff. I'm grateful to her for that because then I get to play in that role too. Interesting though, Mrs. Reagan only had men as a chief of staff. The 4 that served her were men. So, it's a modern phenomenon to actually have a budget. But the way that the language is written is that these are staff of the president assigned to the First Lady, because let's remember, she's not the elected official, he is.
So you were chief of staff to Laura Bush.
Right.
This might not be answerable, but what's the thing about the job, about the role that would surprise us the most? I mean, you've been there's no more, other than having a First Lady with us, you can't have been more intimate with the job in this day and age.
Right.
What would surprise people?
I think it's just how multifaceted it is. I mean, literally, I could go from planning a secret trip to Afghanistan in the morning, which I did 3 times, to planning Queen Elizabeth's state visit in the afternoon. I mean, this is just how varied the job is, going back to the point that there is no one, set of responsibilities for a First Lady. So there's so many different things that you could be doing. I think, I went into the position at the time I had young kids, 3 years old and 6 years old, and I had worked on the West Wing side before then. I was there at 9/11. I was there at some very consequential, demanding periods, and I thought, going from the West Wing to the East Wing, this was going to be a lot easier. Well, my first task is to plan a secret trip to Afghanistan. That was, this is very different, than what I thought it was going to be, but it was great because there was so much impact that you can have to support the policies of the administration. And Mrs. Bush said that to me when she interviewed me for the job. She said, "I'm not here for me. I'm here for George and because of George. But here are the things that I would like to do." And she found ways through her background to use her platform to support the goals of the administration, and that's what we set about to do. And so working collaboratively with my colleagues in the West Wing, that was important. But I think it was just the varied nature of the job, how different every day was. And invariably I would go home at night with a big to-do list for the next day, and I'd never get to it because the urgent always overtakes the important in the White House.
Is she going to, or has she written an essay for your In Pursuit project?
She has, and we're very excited about In Pursuit. And we're going to get to you, sir, so be patient. Yes, she has. In fact, President Bush wrote the first essay for In Pursuit, and I hope you all will sign up for this. It's free. It's on Substack. These come out every Tuesday. An essay on the presidents of the United States, written by prominent people and scholars and journalists and former presidents and former First Ladies. These are 1,200-word essays a lesson in leadership from each of, and challenges and successes in each of our presidents. We cover from George Washington to Barack Obama. We don't do the two most recent presidents because it's too early to be really judging history for either one of them. But George W. Bush wrote the first essay on George Washington, and the lesson was the value of humility. And it's an excellent essay. And then President Obama is writing on Abraham Lincoln. President Clinton is writing on Teddy Roosevelt. Mrs. Obama is writing on Jacqueline Kennedy. Laura Bush is writing on Lady Bird Johnson, her other favorite first lady, in addition to her mother-in-law. Hillary Clinton is writing on Eleanor Roosevelt. I asked the Chief Justice of the United States to write on William Howard Taft, the only president to serve as Chief Justice. So it's I'm writing on Bess Truman. Admiral William McRaven is writing on Harry Truman. These are all being released sequentially between now and the end of the year. The Truman essays will come out in September. But it's a real catalog of wisdom. And in this period of America's 250th birthday, and what we all recognize a need for civic education, that these essays are digestible, they're short, right? Absolutely, thank you. And we have tremendous partners. David, Bill of Rights Institute is writing a curriculum for the K through 12 age. iCivics, founded by Sandra Day O'Connor, is doing elementary school curriculum and tools based on these essays. C-SPAN is using them for C-SPAN Classroom, because what we did ask of all the writers, not only to write the 1,200-word essay, but to record their essay in their voice, so that we will have this forever archived. And we hope to publish a book with all these essays at the end of this. So yes, you gave me an entree to talk about In Pursuit. I'm excited about my essay about Bess Truman. But after what I saw today, some artifacts, I think I have to go add a few things in there. But anyway, yes, they are writing. They readily accepted, and we were thrilled to have their voices.
All right,
Yes,
last
sir.
question.
On a personal note, on the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law
Yes.
relationship,
Yes.
in your opinion, who do you think had the better relationship, the Adams or the Bushes?
Well, you know what was interesting about the Bushes, of course, both first ladies lived through each other's experience, whereas Abigail Adams never got to see her son become a president, but Louisa at least had some experience with her mother-in-law. So I think I would have to say, granted just by the sheer experience of them living through it with each other and knowing both of them, and actually the work that I did with American University when I was asked to do these series of conferences, I went to both Laura and Barbara Bush and asked if they would participate, and they did 4 conferences for me where they were moderated in conversation, once by Doris Kearns Goodwin, another by former archivist of the U.S., and other people that moderated them. It was the first conference that we did, was the first time they sat on the stage together to talk about each other's experiences. And what I was so struck by is how deferential Barbara Bush was to Laura Bush. Yes, it was really, she so admired the global role that she took on. That was not really something that Barbara Bush, the times demanded it. That was the difference. But it was really, I was always struck by every single time that the Bush 41s visited the Bush 43s, that the fact that you had this former president and former first lady that could visit the sitting president and sitting first lady that happened to be their son and daughter-in-law, it always, you know, kind of took my breath away a little bit to see that, because the Adams, of course, did not have that experience, and I'm not sure any of us are going to see, you know, in our lifetime that
Yeah,
happen
relationship.
again.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you for
much.
asking.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I started out by saying how anticipated your visit was, and
This was great
it
for me.
was everything that anybody could have hoped
Thank you,
for.
David.
Anita
You were a
McBride,
terrific moderator.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I enjoyed it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.